Episode of Becoming a Techno Wizard. And we finally continue our series on reading Hegel and learning about the phenomenology of spirit. Or really learning about Hegel and reading his phenomenology of spirit. To recap on the last section in the 19th video, sections 43 and 45, we talked about Hegel continues. I'm reading from Dr. Sadler's description. He says, in these sections, Hegel continues his critique of mathematical cognition and of philosophical approaches which base themselves on this model of cognition. While mathematics does deal with a certain kind of necessity, it is one which remains external or extrinsic to the real things that it will be applied to. And a philosophy modeled along the lines of mathematics is unable to conceptualize its own inadequacy. Yeah, beautiful stuff. Reminds me of, I think I mentioned this before. What's it? The Gödel's incompleteness theorem, things like that, right? With the idea that math can only have, it can either have a full system or a accurate system or something like that, but it can't be both. Like it could be self-consistent and like incorporates everything it does, but that means it incorporates like infinities, which is most likely not realistically accurate. So you can either have one or the other. So math itself is sort of flawed, incomplete um, model. It's extremely valuable and useful, but it's not like perfect. There's no such thing as perfection, anyways. But you know, just in case people get that idea, and before people had this idea that um, math was like perfect language, was God's language. You can describe the entirety of the universe, and you can describe a lot, but as Godel showed, can't describe everything with math. But let's get into sections 46 and 47. I'm gonna share my screen and let's begin.
Nor does the immanent so-called pure mathematics set time as time over against space as the second material for its consideration. Applied mathematics does indeed deal with time as well as with motion and other concrete things. But
Hmm.
the synthetic propositions, that is, propositions regarding relationships determined by their notion, it takes from experience and applies its formula only on those presuppositions.
Mm.
The fact that the so-called proofs of propositions, such as those regarding the equilibrium of the lever, or the relation of space and time in the motion of falling, and so
Mm.
forth, are often given and accepted as proofs itself only proves how great is the need of proof
Mm.
for cognition,
Right.
seeing that where nothing better is to be had, cognition values even the hollow semblance of it, and obtains from it some measure of its satisfaction.
Yeah, so I mentioned this last time, right? How physics and math, you kind of have this proposition where you say, oh, assuming this, right? So you're already making an assumption that something is correct or something is, evident. And you kind of have to do that in order to do math or any sort of physics, at least with our current way of doing things, usually. Um, and that is problematic, right? Because you're assuming something that may not be true in the real world. Right? Assume perfect friction, a perfect frictionless environment, and then we can, right? What? There is no frictionless environment in the real world. Like not even in space. There's still, photons and gravity and all this other stuff affecting different things in different ways. And so when you assume that something is correct or should be your starting base, you're already kind of starting on a shaky, if not inherently unbalanced, kind of foundation. But again, you can still get extremely useful information from it. But it's good to know that.
A critique of these proofs would be as noteworthy as it would be instructive, partly in order to strip mathematics of these fine feathers, partly in order to point out its limitations, and thus show the necessity for a different kind of knowledge. As for time,
Hmm.
which it is to be presumed would constitute as the counterpart of space the material of the other part of pure mathematics, it is the existent
Excuse me.
notion itself. The principle of magnitude, of difference, not determined by the notion, and the principle of equality, of abstract lifeless unity, cannot cope with the sheer unrest of life and its absolute distinction.
Mm.
It is therefore only in a parallelized form, that is, as a numerical unit, that this negativity becomes the second material of mathematical cognition, which, as an external activity, reduces what is self-moving to mere material, so as to possess in it an indifferent external lifeless concept,
Mm.
lifeless content.
Good shit, man. Good
In
stuff.
section 46, Hegel is continuing this criticism of what he calls mathematical cognition, or Kennen, that he began several passages ago, and he's going to introduce a new question here, namely that of time. So let's review for just a moment, what do we mean by mathematical cognition? He doesn't just mean mathematics as a discipline or as a subject matter dealing with numbers, dealing with quantity. What he means is the extension of mathematics into practically everything, the use of it as not just a model, but also a means and a medium for making sense out of all reality. And this was actually something that was, a real going concern in the early modern and even late modern era that he's sort of at the cusp of. We can speak of the mathematization not only of nature, but also this conception that was running through a lot of people's ideas that went on all the way to the Logicist project in the 20th century, that mathematics could really be the basis for making sense out of everything. Mathematics understood in a very broad conception. And why does Hegel consider this to be problematic? Here he's going to discuss it in terms of pure mathematics and applied mathematics. So for those who aren't quite familiar with that distinction, it's probably good to dwell on it a little bit. So when we're talking about pure mathematics, we're talking about engaging in mathematics, you could say for its own sake, without considering how it can apply to particular experiences, particular problems, particular things that we're interested in. We're looking at the relations numbers bear to each other and all the operations that we can perform on them, and everything that can be reduced to or expressed in terms of number. We're looking at that for its own sake, perhaps with an eye to applying it later, but in order to make sense of it on its own terms. Now, when we're talking about applied mathematics, what we're talking about is something that's more experiential. It does, in fact, have a sort of universal schematic quality to it as well. A lever is a lever is a lever, and we can have a general idea of a lever, but we make sense out of levers by reference to actual lived experience to some degree. So Hegel is going to say, how do these two ways of doing mathematics, how do they understand this very important metaphysical, what do we want to call it, not even a concept, this very important metaphysical reality, something that we have to take into account that we call time. And he says, so-called pure mathematics does not set time as time over against space as the second material for its consideration. What does he mean by that? Well, if you think back to your mathematics, whether you had it in high school or college, or if you were really advanced, you did some of this in middle school, and you think in terms of dimensions, the Cartesian coordinates, right? And think of it in 2 dimensions. You can represent a plane, and that could be representing spatiality. You can come up with equations that describe whatever figure that you want to. Leibniz already pointed this out. But any figure you can think of, you can come up with some sort of mathematical formula, however complex, that would express it. What about 3-dimensional things? Yes, we can. As a matter of fact, that's why we can do things like 3D printing, which is really, large extent, an extension of what's been going on in factories with modeling and design for quite some time. Now, what about if we add a 4th dimension? Oftentimes people will talk about time as being the 4th dimension, and the reason why this whole idea of time as being the 4th dimension came about is because if you represent time as a variable, like the variables in space, then you can chart things out, not in a way that we can actually look at in graphic terms. We can do sort of approximations of that kind of thing, but we can conceptualize it in terms of another dimension. You can have x, y, z, and then t. And you can say that what's happening in terms of x, y, z is dependent on where things are at time t is, 1, pick whatever notation you like. If you do that, Hegel's saying, you're really not treating time as something distinct by itself. You're treating it as yet another type of variable, which is like the variables of spatiality. And you can do this. This works. As a matter of fact, it has a lot of applications in real life.
Right.
But are you adequately grasping time by doing so? Hegel would say no.
Exactly.
What about if we turn to applied mathematics? If we're looking at the world of experience, where the terminology that he's using here, he's saying everything that we look at as being Synthetic propositions, these are propositions regarding relationships determined by their notion. These are taken from experience. These are not, when you say that something is a synthetic proposition, he's using this Kantian terminology. It means that things are being brought together. You
Mm-hmm.
can't derive what it is that the proposition is saying just by looking at the parts of it and saying, oh, aha, there we go. There has to be some sort of process of inference going on. Kant
Right.
thought that you could have synthetic propositions a priori where you don't have to have some sort of experience involved. That's not really that big of an issue here. Hegel's point is everything that we're calling synthetic, everything that we're calling, universal truths in terms of mathematics, in terms of motion, experience, mechanics. He uses the example of the lever. All of that is actually derived from our experience or the experience of other people that we've accumulated over time and gradually turned into a discipline or a set of disciplines. Mechanics is really applied mathematics. Descartes actually has this depiction of a tree that mathematics is the root of, and then metaphysics, and mechanics is one portion of it. Medicine and morals were the other two
Mm.
branches coming off of it. So he says the fact that the so-called proofs of propositions, such as those regarding the equilibrium of the lever, the relation of space and time, and the motion of falling, are given and accepted as proofs, only proves how great the need of proof for cognition. Seeing that, where nothing better is to be had, cognition values even the hollow semblance of it. His point there is not to say that it's all fabricated or forget all of it. He's not introducing a kind of skepticism there. He's saying, look, the things that you're actually calling proofs are not proofs in any sort of real sense, which demonstrate the necessity of the phenomena that we're looking at. So
Mm.
we're not going to get our heads around time as philosophers, as scientists in the Wissenschaft sense of science, those who are trying to understand reality, as metaphysicians. We're not going to get our head around time by thinking of it in terms of mathematics.
So basically, as I'm kind of understanding, it's like the age-old thing of philosophy tells you why, right? You can use other realms of science and mathematics to tell you the what and the how, but that's not necessarily the why. And people sometimes say, "Oh, if you have enough of the what and the how, that's the why." Right? In some ways, you can kind of sort of say that, but in many ways, not really. Like, why is there time and at all? you know. Um, and again, I'm not a mathematician or anything like that. So I'm sure people would say you can explain time by explaining why how it works and in our current society or in our current universe. You can start from the Big Bang and the fact that we are three dimensional or we're kind of limited beings and see things in a certain way, certain perspective. Um, but you boil once you get down to get to a certain point, you can only do so much with the math. You need, a greater philosophy to wrap your mind around, that math and trying to fit that math into a greater kind of understanding and perspective that allows us to see things. Like um there's a lot of theories about why the universe is the way it is, like the whole simulation theory with Bostrom, and then the consciousness theory with um shoot, the guy's name. The idea that he has a thing called breaking reality or something like that. That was gonna bother me. I don't think that's what it's called. Case against reality. Yeah, Donald Hoffman. Yeah, and there's another one. There's a lot of these, but another more interesting one is the one with Wolfram Alpha reality. He has his computational thinking type of thing. He has his own series, or I'm sorry, his own theories around the foundational basis of reality. Yeah, we don't have to get on all this now, but the point is like you can do a lot with math, but you need to wrap it up with physics. I mean, with philosophy in order to get a comprehensive understanding of the world. And all these other mathematicians and physicists who are creating these larger theories are also using, philosophical understandings and philosophical ways of looking at the world in order to put the math in a context, right? That's the big thing here, right? When you're doing a proof of math, sure you're proving that math, but it's not it doesn't it's meaningless unless it's in a context, right? That assume this, right? That foundation that you're creating. You have to put that in the context in order for that math to be useful. So in that context is your philosophical practices.
Here, I'd like to
At
bring
least
up a
that's how
little
I
bit of
see
a
it.
digression as well. Um,
Go
why
ahead.
would
I
there be
I
this
digress
sense
too.
that we ought to think of time in terms of mathematics? Is it just that we're attracted to math? Well, this idea has a long pedigree. It goes all the way back to Aristotle, who said that time is the number of change, or quantity, or however you want to
Mm,
parse it out, of kinesis. Kinesios, actually, in the Greek. And sometimes this is talked about in terms of motion, but he's really talking about the broader category of change. He also says a few other things about time that I'll get to in a moment that tie in more closely to what Hegel is expressing here. Well, let's fast forward now to somebody else who's very important in the understanding of the relationship of time to number, and that's Augustine. Augustine says that, strictly speaking, at least from our perspective, the present is all that there is, and it's this tiny little slice, and now this present's gone. The past doesn't exist, the future doesn't yet exist. So where does all this stuff come from? How do we measure something that doesn't actually exist, i.e.
mm,
time? Well, we measure it because we actually have a capacity for keeping track of it, and we do so through a kind of numbering.
mhm,
For example, if we're talking, he uses the examples of long and short syllables, because Latin poetry actually was not based on rhyme, end rhyme, as we're used to in English. It was instead based on meter. And
mm,
meter depends on long and short syllables, it depends on the vowels. There's a whole long story there that I don't need to go into. Suffice it to say, what Augustine was pointing out is that in our minds, we actually compare experiences against each other, and we can say this experience is twice as long as that one.
mm.
Now, is it time itself that's dictating that, or is it our imposing a structure on things
Right.
that's doing so? That's the key question there. Of course, with Augustine, there's God in the picture, and so there's the divine mind, and that complicates things as well. Fast forward now to Kant, who is, looking at these matters after having had, some great mathematicians themselves trying to make sense of these things, like Newton, like Leibniz. Kant will treat time as something that is not out there existing in itself, but actually something that is a form of our intuition of
Mm,
things. We actually have to put our experiences into time and space as well in order for them to be able to make sense to us, in order for there to be sequence. And so again, time and number are intimately connected in the minds of many of these people who are treating metaphysics. So Hegel's going to depart from them, and he's going to ask, what is time?
Just
There,
real quick, I forgot where I heard this or when I started thinking about this, but it's interesting too. It might have been Hoffman, but when you start studying physics and getting deep into the stuff into these like basics of reality, you start seeing that all of this really is like a simulation, right? Like there's no reason why it has to be the way we see it. At least not, we don't know that reason. As far as we know, though, um, once you break down the mathematics and the physics, again, I'm not one of those, but I look into this stuff. Once you break it down, you start to see that time itself is an illusion, right? It's we only notice things moving and changing because we are finite beings, right? Um, and and it's so interesting because even though I kind of grew up religious, I definitely am not anymore. But all the more you learn about science, or at least the more I learn about science, the more kind of spiritual it feels as well. Because again, once you get down to the basics of it, um, you can like break down one's conscious experience into like sort of mind states, right? Into like discrete moments and things like that. And the only reason why these moments are moments is because we are finite and kind of limited in our cognition. We can only kind of um, we're only aware of kind of one stream or one world line, right? One kind of stream of moments happening back to back. But there's when you again when you do the math, it doesn't seem, at least how I have interpreted the math that other people have done. It doesn't seem like there's any specific reason why we should only see things in a single, discrete, linear basis, right? It seems that all of reality exists in one present state, right? There's no future, there's no past. It all just exists. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that well, but it's like when you're thinking about a singularity, it's supposed to be a point where everything is kind of just in together, like on top of each other and stuff like that. But we can't really conceptualize that, right? We can sort of get to the picture of it, but we can't truly conceptualize that because we're not in that kind of moment anymore. Um, and again, when you break down the math, it seems like everything just exists for how it is, right? And so the only reason why we see things in the way we do is because something happened somehow, some way. We experience individual streams of thought, right? That's why I love the quote of "We are the universe's way of knowing itself." Right, sentience or whatever is the universe's way of knowing itself, because that's what it seems like. It seems like everything exists, in some smashed together singularity. No past, no present, no there, no here. Everything's just on top of each other, intermixed. But some way, somehow, the act of knowing things, the act of learning, the act of being sentient, being self-aware, allows you and limits you to seeing things on a linear, time-wise basis. Again, I don't know if I'm explaining that all that well, but to me, that's what's super fascinating about philosophy and science when you really get into it. It's just it all kind of melds together. Um, yeah, it's fascinating.
In order to broach this question, we really need to get away from mathematics and engage in metaphysics. And Hegelian metaphysics is phenomenology. It is attentive to what's going on in consciousness. How do things actually appear to us? So he says, as for time, which it is to be presumed would constitute as a counterpart of space, the material of the other part of pure mathematics, time is the existent notion itself. That's a strange thing to say, because he's not treating time merely as a medium in which other things can occur or be oriented towards each other. He's saying that time itself is the existent notion or concept. He says, the principle of magnitude, of difference not determined by the notion, the principle of equality, cannot cope with, and here he brings up another key term, the sheer restlessness of life and its absolute distinction. And he's not just talking about being alive, he's talking about life in a metaphysical sense, life as that which actually pervades things. Life is itself in motion, but it's not just like a cyclical, circular motion. It's not, random. There is purposiveness to it. There is development that takes place, also decline from time to time. But what's going on is what he's calling the development of the notion, and it's happening through, for human beings, who are the ones who matter, of course, history. We've gotten very far away when we talk about mathematics. We've gotten very far away from mathematics in talking about history. So he says, mathematics and any sort of approach that's going to found itself basically on mathematics cannot actually take account of what's really going on with time. This doesn't mean that it can't grasp certain aspects of time. It doesn't mean that, in treating it as a quantifiable dimension like space, like the 3 dimensions of space, that it's doing something wrong. It's just that that's not an adequate way to understand reality as it develops for human beings who have meanings. There's a few other things that really ought to be said at this point about this. He's saying, what happens when we try to mathematize this? What we're actually trying to grasp slips through our fingers. He says, negativity becomes the second material of mathematical cognition, which as external activity. Remember, we saw that mathematics doesn't really reveal the insides of things. It's a schema that gets superimposed on them. It reduces what is self-moving to mere material, so as to possess it in an indifferent, external, lifeless content. This is the real danger of mathematizing things. It can actually work. And when it does work, it doesn't grasp what it's leaving out, and you can't point out to the not the necessarily the mathematician, because
I don't know why I'm
mathematicians
yawning so
are
much.
actually quite aware of this, but to the person who's bedazzled by mathematics as a medium for doing this sort of stuff, you can't get them to see that something has been left out, because when they when they say to you in good faith, well, show me what's been left out, they're going to demand that it be placed in terms of mathematics.
Mm.
I mentioned that I was going to bring up one other point about Aristotle. Aristotle in the Physics, where he's saying that time is the number of motion with respect to before and after, he also says something else that's very important, which is more in line with what Hegel is saying here about time and about number. Aristotle says that time is that in which potentiality and actuality really work themselves out in relation to each other.
Mm.
That's part of what Hegel is trying to get at in
Potentiality and
talking in
actuality.
terms here of life, of motion, self-movement. He's talking about the development not from pure possibility, not from any sort of mathematical seed that would have to play itself out in a certain way algorithmically or iteratively, but rather he's talking about how potentiality, in an Aristotelian sense, develops itself into actuality. For us human beings, that involves in part purposive activity and choice. And that's really what history is in large part composed of. It's a product of all of that. Likewise, so is Bildung or culture.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
Philosophy, on the other hand, has to do not with unessential determinations, but with a determination insofar as it is essential. Its element and content is not the abstract or non-actual, but the actual, that which posits itself and is alive within itself, existence within its own notion. It is the process which begets and traverses its own moments, and this whole movement constitutes what is positive in it and its truth. This truth therefore includes the negative also, what would be called the false if it could be regarded as something from which one might abstract. The evanescent itself must, on the contrary, be regarded as essential, not as something fixed, cut off from the true, and left lying who knows where outside of it, any more than the true is to be regarded as something on the other side, positive and dead. Appearance is the arising and passing away that does not itself arise and pass away, but is in itself, that is, subsists intrinsically, and constitutes the actuality and the movement of the life of truth. The true is thus the Bacchanalian revel in which no member is not drunk, yet because each member collapses as soon as he drops out, the revel is just as much transparent and simple repose.
I want to read back over that. So he said, appearance is the arising and passing away that does not itself arise and pass away, but is in itself, such as subsists intrinsically. And that says subsists intrinsically. So the appearance of something, right, is not just that it comes and goes away. It's that it kind of like goes from within to without. It's kind of I don't know. He says it here. I can't really put it better than he said it there. But yeah, just subsist intrinsically. Um, not really self-evident per se, but um, I guess that goes into like kind of self-actualizing in a way, and constitutes the actuality and the movement of the life of truth. The true is thus the Bacchanalian revel in which no member is not drunk. Yet because each member collapses as soon as he drops out, the revel is just as much transparent and simple repose. A lot of uh, words that aren't very used very much nowadays. I wonder what Bacchanalian means. I guess it's like a group of people that would party a lot. Okay. I'm spelling that right. Bacchanalian. Roman festivals. Yep, yep. Okay. Interesting. Interesting turn of
Judged in the
phrase.
court of this movement, the simple shapes of spirit do not persist any more than determinate thoughts do, but they are as much positive and necessary moments as they are negative and evanescent. In the whole of the movement seen as a state of repose, what distinguishes itself therein and gives itself particular existence is preserved as something that recollects itself, whose existence is self-knowledge, and whose self-knowledge is just as immediately existence.
Let's break that down, Dr. Sattler.
Close to the end of Hegel's criticisms of mathematical cognition, we have this interesting section, number 47, where he's not going to talk about mathematics at all, but he is going to talk about Bacchanalian revels, in which no member is drunk, yet because each member collapses as soon as he drops out, the revel is just as much transparent and simple repose. So when you think
Mhm.
about Bacchanalian revels, which is where we want to get to in this chapter, and indeed through the phenomenology, you want to think of a big party that you've been to where people are actually moving around, dancing, singing. You might think of a festival rather than a party, because I think for many of us, parties are a little bit more sedate than that.
Mm.
In any case, a Bacchanalian revel, the way that he's picturing it here, a Bacchanalian revel would be one in which everybody would be drunk, because Bacchus is, in fact, the god of wine. He's Dionysus in Greek, he's Bacchus
Mm.
in Latin. But now imagine one where there's a kind of equilibrium and repose to the entirety of the party, the entirety of the revel, even though every single part itself is in fact off kilter, off balance, drunk. And there you've got an image of the entire development of the shapes of consciousness as they're detailed here in Hegel's Phenomenology. This is an image that one should not lose sight of if one wants to understand what's going on in Hegel's discussions. There's always going to be a loss of equilibrium. That's part of what drives the dialectic forward.
Hmm.
But understood as a whole,
Interesting
we
way of
can
putting
reach a
that.
point where we, as the sort of privileged observers in Hegel, can see that this whole thing is like a calm, clean progression. So it's like a
Mm.
mirror image, a distorted mirror image to some degree of what's going on in history. In any case, he starts out saying philosophy is concerned with what? With what is essential, and that means that it's going to be concerned with what is actual, what is Wirkliche, what is able to do something, to exert itself, to show itself, to appear on the stage. And he's going to talk about appearance in just a moment. So he poses this dilemma. How should we understand what is actually essential? How should we make sense out of this? And there are different ways in which one can do this. One classical way of doing this in philosophy, and you still see a lot of people doing
Goodness
this
me.
today, is that we're going to concentrate on what can be the case in every time, irregardless of circumstances. That's where we need to really put our focus. We need to abstract away from the concrete. We need to abstract away from experience. Or we need to at least say all of our experiences in this respect are going to be equal. And,
Hmm.
that's a way of doing philosophy that a lot of people have espoused over time. The problem is, when you do that, what is abstract will also be something that's not actual.
Mm.
So, is what's most important, is what's most real, is what we really need to grasp to work our rear ends off and our brains to comprehend. Is it something that's non-actual? Is it something that's purely ideal, as in existing solely for the mind?
I think
Perhaps it's a
so.
cultural
Golly.
artifact or
Yeah.
something like that? Or is what's essential, in some respect, what becomes actual?
Hmm.
What has to be brought from mere abstraction or potentiality to the state of actuality, to actually existing
Right.
in concrete shapes, in spaces, in times, in cultures, here, there, in this person, and in differentiated ways that are somewhat, again, off kilter. He uses this term self-positing there. Another term that he uses is um, that which is alive within itself, existence in its own notion. And here he's not just talking about individual existences, he's talking about important things that come on the scene in time, in history, in culture, perhaps recurringly, more often than not, but through persons, through subjects, through actually existing concrete human beings. And the question here is, should we be paying attention to the eternal, which is where, a lot of philosophy has been looking, or, and Hegel has no problem with actually using this word evanescent, meaning
Mm.
that which just sort of rises to the surface and exists for a moment and then is gone. What is evanescent is, for example, mayflies that are born for a day, mate, and die.
Mm.
But mayflies as a species continue. That's part of the point here. And so what we need to do is a little bit of erasure so we can see the
That's
bigger
an
point that he's
interesting
actually
point right there,
trying to
right?
make by
Is
introducing this.
the importance of like evanescence of how things can how an overall picture or culture or just thing can continue its life, can propagate its life while the individual aspects of it, right? whether it's the individual people or pieces or whatever, um, themselves are kind of temporary. Humanity itself is a great example of that. We've been here for a couple 100,000 years. Even, you could say a million, 2 million years if you want to count, when we first began to turn into hominids. And so, you know, our span of time is fairly long, even though it seems it's still short in terms of like geographic in terms of the dinosaurs and things like that. But you know, for the most humans, most of us don't really think back a couple generations, much less thousands of years or hundreds of thousands of years or millions of years. But we've been here that long, right? Species has been there that long, and yet our time is so evanescent, right? It's effervescent or whatever, right? It's very short and temporary and you know microscopic in the grand scheme of all of humanity. Um, and it's always a humbling thing to think about, to get that scale in your mind. I brought that up a little bit in my talk for the Gatherverse Summit. Y'all go check that out. Go sign up for the summit. I'm closing the event on February 25th at 10 minutes until 5 p.m. Eastern. So go sign up for that event. I'll also post a video up here after that event. Um, but yeah, it's just so fascinating when you think about that scale. That was just going off topic, but yeah.
This distinction or this dilemma that we have to grapple with. So he's got this famous passage talking about the Bacchanalian revel in which no member is not drunk. And what is he talking about there? He's talking about, let's think about this. We've got a party here. And we've got people in the party. And what happens at parties? People get drunk. They pass out. They dance for a while, and then they're no longer on the scene. They're off the scene, right? And then somebody else comes in to take their place. And in this way, the party can continue and continue and can continue. And sooner or later, all of the original party members have actually left. Perhaps some are passed out in bedrooms under coats. Some hooked up with each other. Some, drove off and threw up in the bushes somewhere. And others are coming in to replace them. I don't need to draw a million different X's here. You get the idea of what I'm after. Hegel's saying that there's this continual process. Now, let's think of this not in terms of a party and people getting drunk, but in terms of truth.
Of knowledge.
In terms of the truth of appearance, the truth of the evanescent. He says,
that's dope. That's a great.
Because each member collapses as soon as he drops out, the revel is just as much transparent and simple repose. Judged in the court of this movement, the simple shapes of spirit. So now think of each of these as being a simple shape of spirit or Geist, consciousness through history. And I'm erasing this in part because we want to think of these as sort of along these sort of lines. They're existing, then they cease to exist, they're succeeding each other. Perhaps we should actually put, all sorts of different things, Y's, O's, Greek letters, numerals. The point is, there is a process here. And considered from the point of view of any one given part of the process, it's completely incomplete. It's inadequate. What happens just with this stage is something comes on the scene, appears, develops itself, is revealed as inadequate, the negativity of it arises, and then it's superseded by something else. And this may be, as Hegel says, sublated, that is, aufgehoben, that taken up into, in its essential moments, into the next stage, but it's done. Remember we had this metaphor earlier on about the flower, the bud, the seeds, all of that sort of stuff. That's the same sort of process. So, considered from the point of view just of one individual state, the single shapes of spirit do not persist any more than determinate thoughts do. So think about your own thoughts and how ephemeral those are. You're thinking about one thing, now you're thinking about another thing. Now you're probably thinking about Hegel, and in 5 minutes you're going to think about, should I have a sandwich? The shapes of consciousness, considered in history, are as ephemeral as that. But, he says, they are as much positive and necessary movements as they are negative and evanescent. In the whole of movement, in the entirety of the process, considered in a state of repose, what distinguishes itself therein and gives itself particular existence is preserved as something which distinguishes itself within and gives itself particular existence, is preserved as something that recollects itself,
Mm.
that remembers this entire process. And this is where Hegel himself would say that he is, as he's writing this book. This is where we ourselves, as we're following along, that's the position that we really occupy. All of
Hmm.
this has happened already, and we're following it out. We're watching the appearances. We're seeing how potentiality works itself into actuality and
Right.
reveals itself as having yet more potentiality that hasn't been realized, and that works itself out more,
That's
and
so
what's
dope.
here in the past starts to die off and give rise to something else, and new changes occur. All of that is able to be grasped from the vantage point of these things having occurred. So he says, something that recollects itself, whose existence is self-knowledge, and whose self-knowledge is just as immediately existence. What's important to point out here with respect to that passage are two things. One is that this is going to be a more theoretical perspective than the active perspectives that are going on through the development of history.
Mm.
The other thing is, this is very important, this vantage point has to be one where we ourselves grasp that we are at this point.
Mm.
We are the ones who have the responsibility of looking back at all the developments of history, seeing what occurred, going through them as much as we can in imagination or perhaps emotion or appreciation, and then conceptualizing it. We cannot be, as you might say, pure passive consumers of something like the phenomenology.
Right.
A
Gotta
consumer
partake
attitude
in
towards this of
it.
just show me the stuff, just entertain me, just give me the data. We've already seen that Hegel says, look, you're not going to get anything out of this book if that's the attitude that you take towards it. You have to some degree, go along for the ride.
Hmm. Oh wow. But yeah, you gotta just jump in there and tackle it. You gotta tackle this knowledge and try to understand what's going on and stuff like that, man. I love this. I think it's a really fantastic section right here. Really great book so far. Looking forward to the rest. But yeah, that's absolutely fantastic. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Let me know what you think, what you learned from this, if you did, if you got this far. So sorry for all my yawnings. This is what I get for doing this after work, especially as a really busy day at work. Um, but it is what it is. I wanted to stop missing freaking days, missing my streams, and be consistent. Because there's so much. I really do enjoy this, but sometimes I just be way too tired or busy. Um, but I did this one. So as always, thanks and have a great day. See ya. Bye bye.